Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. Today's video is going to be consisted of 3 different topics, which are going to be the Harlem Race Riot of 1964, the Rochester Rebellion of 1964, and the Chicago Dixmoor Riots of 1964. Okay, so the first riot is the Harlem Race Riot of 1964. The Harlem Riot was one of many uprisings or protests that took place in many cities across the United States during the 1960s. As elsewhere, the Harlem African Americans reacted to racial discrimination, segregation, police brutality, and social injustice that was currently dominating their lives. They resorted to violence to express their utter disgust with the system at the time. And ironically enough, the Harlem Riot occurred just 2 weeks after the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which was signed into law by President Lyndon Johnson. The act, which outlawed discrimination based on race, color, sex, religion, and nationality, was the most sweeping measure that was ever adopted by the nation to guarantee racial justice. And the irony lies in the fact that while the Civil Rights Act made it illegal to discriminate against a U.S. citizen based on race or color, the discriminatory socioeconomic systems and structures that were long in place in the nation did not change with this new law. So the Harlem Uprising began on July 16, 1964, when a 15-year-old named James Powell was shot and killed by a white off-duty police lieutenant whose name was Thomas Gilligan. The Harlem community was infuriated by the murder, which it was kind of viewed as an unnecessary example of police brutality. So the Harlemites were convinced that Officer Gilligan, who was a war veteran and an experienced police officer, could have found a different way to handle that situation, such as arrest or subduing Powell without using deadly force. The first 2 days following the shooting saw peaceful protesting in Harlem and other areas of New York City, but on July 18th, some of the protesters went to the Harlem police station calling for the resignation or termination of Officer Gilligan, and police officers were on guard outside the building. And as tension grew and anger consumed a lot of people, some in the crowd began to throw bricks, bottles, and rocks at the officers, who waded into the crowd using their nightsticks. When the word of the confrontation spread around the neighborhood, rioting ensued first in Harlem and then spread into Bedford, the Black and Puerto Rican section of Brooklyn. The race riot in the 2 boroughs of New York City lasted 2 days, and it included breaking windows, looting, vandalism, and setting a variety of local businesses on fire. But when the rebellion ended on July 22nd, 1 black resident was killed, and there were more than 100 injuries, 450 arrests, and around $1 million in property damage. This Harlem uprising was the beginning of a series of violent confrontations with police in more than a dozen cities throughout the North, including Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, the New Jersey cities of New Jersey City, Paterson, and Elizabeth, as well as the Chicago, Dixmoor, Illinois, making it the most violent in terms of urban rioting since 1919. These rebellions, as well as civil rights protests, mainly in the South, kind of helped designate the summer of 1964, known as the Red Summer. So the next one is the Rochester Rebellion of 1964, and Rochester, New York's uprising began on July 24th, 1964, and this actually occurred less than a week after the Harlem Riot. The Rochester Rebellion came as a surprise to many of the white residences in the area because of the city's history of progressive 19th century politics, and a large part of that history was kind of revolved around the Underground Railroad and resident abolitionist Frederick Douglass, as well as the women's rights activist Susan B. Anthony, as both were buried in the city's Mount Hope Cemetery. Despite the historical legacy, though, African Americans in the mid-20th century Rochester faced housing and employment discrimination, and the schools were segregated, and police-black community relations were as strained in Rochester as in any major city in the North. And much of the tension was kind of fueled by the rapid growth of Rochester's black population, which increased from around 8,000 in 1950 to around 32,000 in 1964. Most of these newcomers were funneled into dilapidated housing in Upper Falls, Rochester, the site where this riot began. Black residents of Upper Falls had an employment rate 6 times higher than whites within the same community. Many of the migrants were publicly disparaged and humiliated. They were often called bean pickers by their white neighbors, and ironically, though, slum clearance and urban renewal policies designated to get rid of the dilapidated structures that housed these newcomers often ended up eliminating vast areas of housing without any type of replacement dwellings for those forced to move, and all of these factors created the atmosphere for the rebellion in 1964. So Rochester's rebellion began on Friday night, July 24th, on a South Street in Rochester's 7th Ward. It started out as a block party with 200 people present. At 10 p.m., Rochester police arrested Randy Manigault, a 19-year-old African-American man, for public intoxication and harassing women at the party. Signed, the arrest was made in an atmosphere of tension. Additional police were called to the scene because false rumors of an assault on a pregnant woman by a police officer and a child by a police dog spread through the crowd at the party and soon into the surrounding neighborhood. And by this point, Rochester Police Chief William Lombard was on the scene personally directing his officers. And when he ordered the crowd to move, many young African Americans began throwing rocks at the police cars, and one police car was overturned. By 11:30 p.m., more than 400 people were battling the police, and all available officers went to the streets. At 2 a.m., Chief Lombard ordered the police officers to use riot weapons on the crowd, and by 3:30 a.m., the crowd had grown to 2,000 people, and looting began on Clinton Avenue, the main thoroughfare through Upper Falls. And by 9 a.m. on July 25th, the uprising was officially called a riot, and a state of emergency was declared by the New York Governor Nelson Rockefeller. While the rioting calmed during the day on Saturday, by 10 p.m. the Saturday night it resumed. Okay, I am back. It started raining, and I tried to get away from the sound, but I'm starting to realize that that's not gonna happen. So, like I was saying, the I lost my place. Okay, yes, New York Governor Nelson Rockefeller. While the rioting calmed during the day on Saturday, by 10 p.m. Saturday night it resumed, and by that point, one white man had died. And by Sunday night, when the riot had ended, approximately 250 stores were looted, 5 white people died, 4 men died in a helicopter crash blamed on the riot, and nearly 350 people were injured. The police had arrested more than 900 people in connection with the uprising, and the majority were employed black men between 20 and 40 years old, with no prior records of violence. Only 15% of those arrested were white, and through their actions, participants in the Rochester Rebellion debunked several local myths. First, that racial discrimination was mainly a Southern issue. Second, that most whites in Rochester were progressive. And finally, that upstate New York African Americans had no issue with discrimination, which were all proven wrong during this incident. Okay, now the very last riot is the Chicago Dixmoor Riot of 1964. And this riot was centered in Dixmoor, Illinois, a suburb southwest of the city. And by 1960, Dixmoor had less than 4,000 residences. And of that population, over 50% of its residents were in fact black. A large portion of Dixmoor's black population were recently arrived migrants from Mississippi, Tennessee, and other southern states. This increase in population placed a heavy strain on the struggling and currently struggling black community. Like African Americans nationwide, Dixmoor's black residents were twice as likely to face poverty as local whites and almost 3 times as likely to become unemployed. Local whites often promoted discrimination in employment and housing segregation, and these practices intensified racial tension between black and white Dixmoor residents, which reached a boiling point in 1964. The riot stemmed from an incident that took place on August 15th when Blondella Woods, a black Dixmoor resident, was alleged to have stolen items from Foremost Liquor Store. Store owner Michael Lapota apprehended Woods and physically attacked her. Woods was arrested by police, but Lapota faced no criminal charges for his assault against Woods. After Woods' arrest and the dismissal of assault charges against Lapota, the black community of Dixmoor on August 16th initiated a boycott of the Foremost Liquor Store accompanied by protest marches. They protested in part because this episode recalled for black migrants to Dixmoor the harsh brutality that they face from police and the criminal justice system in southern states. They and other Dixmoor natives came together to support the boycott and to engage in a larger fight against racial injustice similar to the national civil rights protests occurring across the nation. Dixmoor's black residents initially engaged in peaceful demonstrations to promote the boycott, but by the evening the protesters attacked the Foremost Liquor Store. In response, the city officials, like the mayor and the protection of the city, brought in officers from the Chicago Police Department, the CPD, to confront the protesters. And Chicago police officers adopted a shoot-on-sight policy in response to any protester who, in their opinion, engaged in violence or resisted their orders. That policy enraged young local African Americans even more, and they began to attack passing motorists, throwing rocks, bottles, stones, and bricks. Illinois state troopers that also arrived on the scene fired over the heads of the rioters, and by the morning of August 17th, when the violence finally ended, over 225 officers from the Cook County Sheriff's Department, the Chicago Police Department, and the Illinois State Troopers were in Dixmoor. The conflict involved approximately 1,000 people, including 37 Dixmoor protesters and rioters who were seriously injured, and 25 people who were arrested. Local civil rights leaders claim that the most of the injuries stemmed from the violence of the CPD against black rioters, while smaller than most black police confrontations in 1964 and the ones that followed during the rest of the decade. The Dixmoor riot was a constant reminder that many blacks all across the nation would, peacefully if possible, but violently if necessary, challenge the racial order in the United States. And this concludes the end of my video. I hope you enjoyed and really learned something. So I will see you guys in the next one.